Great. Thanks everybody for being here while we talk about Frances Perkins as the Secretary of Labor. And this is a workshop we're doing in partnership with East Tennessee Historical Society. So I'm going to let Layla, as a representative of ETHS, give us our introduction today.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Graham. Hi, my name is Layla Smallwood. I'm the Education Program Manager for the East Tennessee Historical Society, and we are so excited to be partnering with Teaching with Primary Sources MTSU for this awesome virtual program. In addition to our virtual programming we've been offering, we also have an in-person workshop coming up. I just wanted to kind of plug for that. On March 31st in Knoxville at the East Tennessee History Center, we're going to have a Back to the Basics, Strategies for Using Primary Sources workshop at the East Tennessee History Center downtown Knoxville. It's going to be a full day, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. That's Eastern time workshop. So please come see us to register. Just email Lisa Oakley. I'm going to drop her email in the chat box in a moment, as well as my email. I also wanted to share that we have a new exhibit opening up at the Museum of East Tennessee History. It's our temporary exhibit. It's celebrating 40 years. I know it's hard to believe, but 40 years since the World's Fair came to Knoxville. So we are having that temporary exhibit open mid-March. So please come visit us in downtown Knoxville to see that. It's going to be really fun, a lot of interactive pieces within that temporary exhibit as well. And then the last thing I want to share with you all is the Gilder Lairman Teacher of the Year nominations. We have those deadlines coming up as well. And I'll drop these links in the chat box for you all as well. But we have that deadline for 2022 nominations coming up. So if you know a teacher who really should be nominated, send that in. The nominations are due April 30th, 2022. So it's coming up. And then the nominees will need to submit their supporting materials by May 30th, 2022. I'm going to drop this link with important calendar dates in the chat box. I'm also going to drop the frequently asked questions link too, because that's really helpful on telling you who's eligible and how these dates kind of align over the next spring semester. So I will put my email in the chat box, Lisa Oakley's email in the chat box, and those links that I just mentioned. We're super excited about this webinar, and I can't wait to see what Teaching with Primary Sources MTSU is going to do today. Thanks, y'all.
All right, thanks, Layla. The way that today's webinar is going to go is I'm going to talk for a small amount of time about Frances Perkins and who she was and what she did. And then October is going to be presenting this lesson plan that she's working on. It's still in its stages of being worked on, so it's not yet completed on our website, but that means you can pipe in and interact with it. And then, so that will be a big chunk out of the middle. And then I will come back after October is finished and go through some resources that are related to this topic that you might be able to use in your classroom. So Kira has put the link for the contact form in the chat box, so make sure that you click on that and have it in an open tab. I'm also going to put a link into the box right now. And this is a link to a Google Drive folder that has both of the PowerPoints that you're going to see in today's webinar, the one that I'm going to use and the one October is going to use. And so that way you can have your own copies, because a lot of the things that you'll see on there will be hyperlinked, and so it'll be useful for you to download that yourself. So I will try to also drop those links in at the very end of the webinar in case you lost them in the meantime. I'm going to start off with a poll. So I'm going to launch it. And the question is, which of the following was Frances Perkins instrumental in achieving? And you can select as many of these as you think are correct. Oh, I will read them off because I know that people watching us I just remembered that. So the choices, for those of you who are not participating live, are Social Security, minimum wage, 40-hour work week, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, Civilian Conservation Corps, federal law against child labor, and federal aid to states for unemployment relief. So there's quite a bit of options here, and you can pick as many of them as sound appropriate. All right, well, it looks like everyone has answered. So I'm going to, oh, okay, now everyone. All right, I'm gonna end the poll. And it looks like most people chose Social Security and minimum wage. And then a lot of people also voted for 40-hour work week, workers' comp, unemployment insurance, federal law against child labor, and federal aid to states for unemployment relief. And then we also had a couple of votes for Civilian Conservation Corps. So sorry, I'm sharing the results right now. I forgot to press that button a little bit earlier. So now you can all see that at least a couple of you have voted for all of them, and several of you voted for most of them. And we will see who's right in just a moment. I'm going to close that poll, and I am going to start sharing my screen. I'm going to okay, hold on one second. I'm going to open up my PowerPoint. Okay, can you see the PowerPoint screen? Right. So Frances Perkins. And I hope that many of you are already familiar with her. I'm sure you are if you're interested in this webinar. But yes, she was a Secretary of Labor for the United States. And this image that you see here is one of several photographs of her taken during her time in office as Secretary of Labor that are available at the Library of Congress website in the public domain. So there's lots of really great images, both posed like this and candid of her at work that you can share with your students to kind of show Secretary of Labor in action. Okay, so she lived from 1880 to 1965. So pretty much she straddled, she was coming of age during the heyday of the progressive era in the United States. And of course, that very much impacted her development. And then, you know, she lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and a lot of the civil rights movement. So very momentous time for her. And let's talk about her for a little bit. The biggest first that she's credited with is being the first female cabinet secretary in the United States ever. And she was appointed, of course, by Franklin D. Roosevelt. So kudos to him for that. She was also the longest serving Secretary of Labor, serving for 12 years. And partly this is because FDR was president for 3 terms, and she was his Secretary of Labor throughout the whole thing. And there is an author webcast about her on the Library of Congress, and the author was telling the audience about a bus tour that she went on. And when they went past the Labor building, the bus driver said this joke. Which cabinet member had the worst childbirth experience? And the answer was Frances Perkins, because she spent 12 years in labor. And everybody just face palmed. And so there you go, corny joke for the day at Frances Perkins' expense. She is credited with establishing, or at least being very instrumental in establishing, the Civilian Conservation Corps. So if you voted for that, you're correct. Social Security, absolutely correct. That's one of her main accomplishments, and many more that we will get to. In fact, everything on that list was something that she was instrumental in accomplishing. So it was a little bit of a trick question. But the only goal that she had from the get-go that she did not achieve was universal health care. And that's a goal that nobody has been able to achieve yet in the United States. So we will see when that one will come to fruition. So for a moment, though, I want to talk about the Secretary of Labor's job in general and what they do. And this is something that you might have to pause and go over with your students, because they might know about different cabinet secretaries, but have no clue kind of what they do. So I'm going to go through a quick list, and then I'm going to show you a website. So obviously, the Secretary of Labor heads the Department of Labor. And this department was created in 1913. It was one of the things that President Taft did on his way out of office right before Woodrow Wilson came in. So this is very much born in the progressive era as part of a reaction to a lot of the movement for workers' rights. And the Department of Labor and the Secretary of Labor, their job is to look out for the welfare of wage earners. So they are stated to be on the side of the workers, and of course, also with the public good in mind. So obviously, when it's flipped back and forth between Democratic and Republican administrations, there's been different emphasis on working on workers' rights versus, working more with the business end of labor. That's obviously something that constantly goes back and forth. But when it was established, it was very much to protect workers' rights against growing corporations. I'm going to get back to this, but because of Zoom, it's hard for me to bounce back and forth between a PowerPoint and a website. So I will ask the question of who the current Secretary of Labor is in just a moment. But if you know, without looking it up, pop it into the chat box. So of course, as a cabinet secretary, this person reports directly to the president. So this is the person that the president goes to with any kind of labor issue whatsoever. And so they oversee all the labor relations. That includes unemployment, that includes retirement. So in other words, it also includes non-labor, the lack of labor, the absence of labor, or what happens after labor. They help in crafting legislation that hopefully Congress will or will not pass afterwards, and in regulations from bills. And they oversee a wide variety of agencies and programs that are all under the umbrella of the Department of Labor. And this has changed over time quite a bit. But some of the main ones today are the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of International Labor Affairs, Employee Benefits Security Administration, OSHA, and many more. And I'm actually going to stop sharing for just a quick second. And well, I'm going to switch my screen over so that you can see. Now, did anyone come up with the answer for who our current Secretary of Labor is? Nobody? Well, it's not one of the flashier jobs, right? It's not Department of State, and if I have to confess, I did not know until I started putting together this Marty Walsh. He is President Biden's pick for Secretary of Labor. So that's who our Secretary of Labor currently is. Now, so this is the link from the PowerPoint slide that I just showed you. And it takes you to the US Department of Labor website, which is a great resource. And I'm going to show you real fast just by hovering over the tab for agencies. Okay, that's not coming up. I'm gonna have to press it. All right. These are all the agencies under that umbrella. So you can see it's quite a lot. And they have to do, of course, mine safety, Office of the Inspector General, the Women's Bureau, Wage and Hour Division, Administrative Review, so many different kinds of review boards and stuff, all having to do with work, working people, people who provide work, people who do the work, people who want to do the work but aren't doing work, veterans employment, and everything like that. And this is also going to be another link from this page is going to come up under the resources section later on. So we'll get back to that in a minute. I'm going to go back to sharing my PowerPoint now. All right, so that we can talk more about Frances Perkins. Okay, So she was from a family in Massachusetts, but that had really deep roots in Maine. Her family was here before the founding of the United States. They were longtime pioneers. And so she had a really long and illustrious kind of patriotic lineage and a value for education in her family. So she was educated in the classics largely by her father, and she went to Mount Holyoke and studied physics and biology and chemistry. But while she was there, she also had a teacher who made the class go out and look at working conditions in a nearby factory, and that just inspired her for the rest of her life. And she got involved in the National Consumers League, and that was kind of the beginning of her consciousness of working conditions in the United States. Another thing that was a huge turning point in her consciousness, and I see that some of you, have heard of this before, and I had also heard of this before as well, but she was actually having tea with a group of ladies across the street when the Triangle Factory fire in New York City happened in 1911. So she went out onto this and she saw the women jumping from a burning building and to their tragic deaths on the sidewalk. And she was, of course, incredibly shaken by this. And she wanted to be more involved in, what can I do to help make sure that this doesn't happen again? Why did this happen and how can we fix it? Again, very much a progressive reformer here. And so Theodore Roosevelt actually got her, used some of his influence to get her onto the New York City Committee on Safety. And this is where she had, she started kind of an official career, and it was in New York State, because that's where she eventually ended up. She had, from Mount Holyoke, she'd actually gone to Illinois, and she spent a little while in Lake Forest, Illinois, where she would commute to Chicago and visit Hull House and met Jane Addams there. So again, very much rooted in the progressive movement. And so from her position on the New York City Committee on Safety, she worked under Governor Al Smith, who was a very famous and well-known governor who was on the side of labor, a progressive era governor, very much so. Unsuccessfully ran for president of the United States at one point. But he appointed her to the Industrial Commission of the state of New York. And they actually created a lot of laws that became blueprints for the federal laws later on. So she brought a lot of this experience with her into Washington. And she worked in the commission as commissioner when FDR was governor of New York. And so when he became president, he brought her with him. And she stipulated, well, I'm not going to take the position of your Secretary of Labor unless you let me do this, 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 and this. And he's like, okay. And like I said, she got all of her things done except for the universal healthcare. So she's often considered to be one of the true architects behind the New Deal. And this is a picture here of her standing with two labor representatives. The person on the left, sorry, I can't remember his name, but he was president of the AFL-CIO, and the one on the right is John Lewis, not the Joe Lewis, but John Lewis, who was mine workers labor union leader. So she had a not always very successful relationship with the union leaders, but all of the concerns with the union movement fell under her job at the Department of Labor. So she had to work with them. So one of the very first programs, it was the CCC, because this has to do with work, right? You're giving jobs to unemployed young men, which created had a lot of impact on the landscape of Tennessee and other states as well, as we know. She was also very instrumental in passing the Federal Emergency Relief Administration Act in 1933. Those are two early successes. But her biggest one was Social Security, which went through in 1935. And if I'm lucky, I'm going to craft a lesson idea on this for our next newsletter, so that if you need to know more about Social Security and you need to teach more about Social Security, hopefully you'll be able to do that next month. So the main provisions under the Social Security Act that she wrote into it: retirement savings, of course, aid to the poor, elderly, unemployed, and dependent children. So not just people who worked their whole career and then need a pension at the end of it, but also people who have trouble working, period, or who can't work. However, because this was during the era of Jim Crow, there were a lot of people left off of the benefit rolls. And so domestic workers were not included in this, neither were agricultural workers. And of course, that included a lot of women and people of color. So there was a lot of disparity, that's the word I'm going for, sorry, in terms of how this was promulgated. And it was less fair to women and people of color, as so many other things in the 1930s were. Remember, this is like during the Great Depression, and she needs to, make sure that she can get the main problems dealt with. Also, another one of her main achievements, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established the minimum wage, so the minimum work week, and finally, a federal ban on child labor. It took that long. So if you are, if any of these have any impact on your life, then you can thank Frances Perkins daily. And of course, these are just a few examples, because all the working related bills that passed during her tenure there were things that she had an impact on, but some of them are not so much her creation as things that she was kind of involved in a secondary role, like the
I think we may have lost Stacy.
national labor shit.
Oh, okay, are you back? Nope, I think we lost Stacy.
Can you?
Oh, you're back for a second. All right, we'll give her a second. I know a minute ago when she had problems, she ducked out and come right back in. So we'll see if that she's able to do that. And if not, we may shift gears to October for, let's see. So she pops back in here.
Y'all need you have the PowerPoint, right?
I do not.
Okay, I can send the link to you too.
I'm back. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, I was pretty much done with what I was going to do anyway. So instead of me trying to do more stuff right now and getting kicked off again, I'm going to turn things over to October, and then I will revisit my last slide when I get to the resources section. So October.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Graham. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hi, so I'm going to be talking about a lesson idea on how you can teach Frances Perkins in your classrooms with primary sources. So this was a little bit difficult working with Library of Congress primary sources, just because a lot of what Frances Perkins would have been involved in, as per Dr. Graham's introduction, was a lot of law and legal bills and things that I don't think most students would have trouble with reading. I have trouble reading a bunch of penal code and law code, so I'm sure they will too. So a different way that's a little more approachable with your students is looking at Frances Perkins in the media and how she was represented and talked about in common discourse in newspapers. And this is a really great resource with the Library of Congress's Chronicling America. If you just type in Frances Perkins, quite a lot pops up on that exhibit. And it's a great way of showing how she was portrayed during, before, and after her time as Secretary of Labor, and what she was like in public discourse and through multiple viewpoints, since a lot of people liked her, a lot of people disliked her. You're going to get a lot of different views over time looking at newspapers. So I just picked a couple to go through with you guys today. There will be more again once the lesson plan is finalized and formatted on our website. But just for now, these are all hyperlinked. So these blue links down here will take you to the original newspaper so you can get the entire context, since these are just clips of what I could fit on this PowerPoint and what I thought would be most important to show to your students. So they're not the whole clips, but if you want to have them read the entire article, those are also hyperlinked within this PowerPoint. So I'm actually not going to read this one out to y'all because it's really just what Dr. Graham said in her introduction. This was a paper article written about Frances Perkins right before she was announced that she was going to be a cabinet member, the first female cabinet member. So it really just goes over her early career. And this will be a way to, from a primary source point of view, introduce your students to her early career and how she described and how the author described her personality within her early career in labor and the progressive era during labor reform. I will go over this one with you because I just think it's a little interesting, and we're getting kind of that, do they like her? Do they not like her? How do people perceive her as a person when it comes to Frances Perkins? So this one was written in 1934. She would have been about a year into her position as Secretary of Labor, and it was published in the Key West Citizen, which is a newspaper in Key West, Florida. And the headline was, Washington headliners, Frances Perkins shields her private life from the limelight. So, a small, dark-haired woman named Frances Perkins has succeeded in maintaining her cool New England reserve, even while she plays one of the New Deal's most conspicuous roles. The fact that she's the first woman to hold a cabinet job hasn't made it easy for her to keep the limelight from her private life, but the present Secretary of Labor remains I always struggle with this word, enigmatic as Mona Lisa's smile in this town of gossip and rumors. With a penchant for facts and figures, she has done a determined job in the Labor Department, and her philosophies flavor many of the Roosevelt doctrines. Her home address and telephone number, however, are private. Reporters attending her weekly press conferences may absorb some of the thrills she gets from telling of increased factory employment and payrolls, but they leave without learning anything of Frances Perkins herself. When she moved into the Labor Department a little more than a year ago, she found a secret service and staff tracking down alleged Reds. She abolished it, discharged 55 special immigration investigators, and turned the emphasis to building up a statistical service that would give an accurate picture of the Depression. Turning to cupboards crammed with plans people had poured in for curing the Depression, she sorted them, classified them, called labor leaders in to talk about the ideas, and reported results to the president. Soon she saw many of them functioning. What the well-dressed woman is wearing this session doesn't interest her much. Perhaps she reasons that if she keeps wearing the same tricorn hat and black evening dress to the White House, eventually the reporters will stop recounting it as news. Her interests are planted deep into New England soil. To her belongs the old Perkins place up there. She keeps the address carefully hidden so that when she goes there, she can be the same Frances Perkins she was before fame started bothering her. The neighbors bring her donuts and apple pie. She started her collection of quotes up there. Her door was one of the first in Greenwich Village to carry two names for a married pair, Frances Perkins and Paul Wilson. They were then and still are an idealistic, social-minded couple. Her husband, who has been ill a great deal in recent years, is an able statistician. So that's the first clipping from a newspaper article I wanted to share with y'all. And just a couple of the questions that you could ask your students with this, and I will pose this to you guys as well if you want to answer for people who are showing up in the live in the chat. So what is the author's impression of Perkins? And also, what is this article saying about the way that Perkins handles the press, her public image, and her private life? And I can't see you guys' comments, so if either Kira or Dr. Graham or Layla, if you want to read them out as they come in.
So there's been a couple comments about, her this being more about her personally, and her desire to keep her personal life personal, instead of, about what she's actually doing.
Yes, that's a great point. I found that to be quite funny as well, where they're just like a little stanzas like, yeah, she's being really effective and a great statistician, but also, why don't we know where she lives?
Well, and also, yeah, me too, Lauren. It reminds Lauren of reporters who ask powerful women questions that they never ask men. Like, they want to talk about her quilts and donuts and apple pie, but would they ever ask that if she were a male Secretary of Labor? It's like they don't even know what to do with a professional woman. And still don't.
Still don't. Yes, that's why I picked this. I thought it was so funny. It reminded me of kind of the way paparazzi act around celebrities, where they have to know every single thing about you. And it's like, why? I have my career. I am a celebrity. I perform. In this case, she's a cabinet member. She does her job well. Why do you also need to know everything about my private life? And very invasive. Like, even if you're not a cabinet member, why would you give your address out to newspapers? And why do they need to know all about your private life? Like, what's the point of you knowing my address? That seems dangerous. But it's kind of expected of her. And the fact that at her weekly meetings, when she's talking about things she's doing for the Labor Department, she's supposed to also talk about her private life, which has nothing to do with what she's doing at the Department of Labor. So just an interesting question to ask you, how her gender affected the way that she's portrayed in newspapers. She's kind of portrayed as being too secretive and too hiding, when really she's just separating her private life from her public life. And I think most cabinet members or politicians or celebrities would do that then and today. So great. Moving on to the next one. This one also a lot about gender. This one is after Frances Perkins left office, June 18, 1945, and it came from the Henderson Daily Dispatch from Henderson, North Carolina. So, Frances Perkins, first woman Secretary of Labor in the Cabinet of the President of the United States, is about to pass from the official Washington scene. In fact, she has passed from the Washington scene with the appointment of the new Labor Secretary, Judge Louis Schwellenbach. Already, Ms. Perkins has packed away the famous tricorn hat, her identification tag. No longer can little quips and jokes be made about Fanny. Miss Perkins' regime is over. Miss Perkins' manner of departure is none too magnificent, I'll admit that. But between you and me and the prejudice we all have against women in public office, Miss Perkins has been a much maligned woman. Any woman in public office is a much maligned woman. Oh, yes, sir, she is. And yes, my dear, she is much maligned. Any woman and every woman who steps out into the limelight of office holding has two strikes against her. People used to think of women in public life as a combination of Carrie Nation and the picture on the old Dutch cleanser can. Wow. Can I not read today? Cleanser can. Many people used to think the female who dared to stand outspokenly for a conviction or two was tough enough to ride a broomstick. This broomstick conception of the independent woman still clings to some of the modern-minded women in the public life. You may be as modern as you please in your private life, but you therefore supply much juicy gossip. Lately, however, the popular conception of a woman in public life is changing from grim to becoming less and less descriptive. The woman in public life is now often thought of as cute. Yes, cute. There you have it, from grim to cute. There is no compromise. If a woman isn't too careful about her appearance, if she is thinking more of the speech she is about to make than whether the shade of red on her hat matches the shade of red on her handbag, then she reverts back to grim. And if her color scheme is perfect, then she is labeled cute. In other words, the female of the species is far from emancipated. She is more tied down in many ways than her grandmother was. She has made herself a competitor of the male. I mean, an open competitor. And it may be she has been pretty silly to expose herself to every known type of envy. Poor Frances Perkins. She was an example of all the things I've been talking about. Yet I have heard well-informed Washingtonians say that she has been a far superior Secretary of Labor to the men who preceded her in office. Before Ms. Perkins came to town, the labor post had often been filled by men who were notably incompetent or who had been afflicted with weakness when they met a tough problem. Making deals of one sort or another was not the uncommon practice of labor secretaries. Labor before Frances Perkins rarely raised its whip-down head. Walking over labor was a common pastime. It was no trick at all to keep labor flattened out. Miss Perkins came in on a new tide of thought and action. Labor, suddenly aware of its strength, was raring to go, and it did go. And there sat Miss Perkins within her own rather stiff personality, surrounded and protected by secretaries, trying to hold on to the principles she believed in and at the same time express the policies of a New Deal, which didn't always know what it believed in. I have an idea that when all of the excitement has died down, Miss Perkins will be discovered to have been a pretty fine cabinet officer. I have an idea too that if she had been a man, many of her mistakes would have been regarded as bold successes or at least overlooked. If she had been less grim and more cute, there would not have been so many jokes about her. On the other hand, if she had been more cute than grim, she might not have done the job at all. I don't know what the answer is. You figured it out. There are 2 strikes against women in public office. And privately, I think that it just as well. And privately, I think it is just as well there are because you simply can't give us too much rope. You might hang ourselves and the rest of the world with us. So that was a bit of a long one. But that one, again, commenting a lot on gender, women in public office, and how the perceivance of women in public office affected Frances Perkins. So questions you can ask your students with this newspaper clip, and this is actually the whole article. I tried to clip it and I just, it didn't make sense. And it was such an interesting article to read. So I wanted to read the whole one for you guys. But what is this reporter's view on the way that women are treated in public office? And how does Frances Perkins fit into this reporter's assessment of women's expectations in public office?
In the chat box, we're wondering a bit about the significance of both of these having been written by female correspondents, because the last one sounded pretty against women in the public eye, and this one sounds like, I think, sympathetic, but it could be read in other ways too.
That's interesting. Yeah, tone is a little hard for this one. In some areas, she sounds very sarcastic, like, oh my gosh, why does the color of our lipstick have to match our handbag? And don't give us too much power, we might hang ourselves and the rest of the world. But in some cases, she also sounds very much against women in public office, because then she's like wondering why they would even want to be in public office if they know they're going to be perceived this way, which is probably not the best way to make change in the way women are perceived in public office. So tone is definitely something you can bring up with your students about what's the overall message. And yes, there is an implication that both of these so far were written by women.
I mean,
I read part of that
ahead,
as
Karen.
almost sarcastic, like the
Yeah.
So I, it's interesting.
Like she's definitely, Helen Essery has definitely put up with a lot of this grim versus cute herself. I can just tell, but it is one of the comments was it's hard to tell whether she's for Frances Perkins or against her, not even as a woman, but because she does throw in there in a couple places, I've heard that she's actually better than most men in this position. And it's like, she could have led with that, but she's like buried that pretty deep in. But it's almost like, she's great at her job, but that doesn't matter because this is what the whole kerfuffle is about,
Mm-hmm. Most definitely. Yeah. This will definitely, I think, rise up some questions with students about tone, about meaning, whether or not I would even ask students if they think this is something that they still think happens today. Are women, and I think when she's saying broomstick, she's alluding to a witch. So are women too grim and witchy when they're in office, or are they too cute when they're in office? And is there a way, is that binary still existing in the public eye and public discourse when it comes to women in office? So definitely a lot you can do with this newspaper clip. And I would even, again, we didn't read the first one, but the first one was before she started her career and the way that she was portrayed. And then this one is after her career is over. And again, what does that sense of time do to the way that she's perceived versus how she's described in the first one and how she's described in this one? As someone who's read the full article, I think it's very different. The first one very much praises her for the work that she's done so far. It calls her a crusader for labor movements and for female rights movements. Whereas this one's kind of like, yeah, she's good, but did she leave the best impression? No, because she was just a little bit too much of a witch, a little bit too much grim. She should have been cuter. But then if she was cuter, would she have been effective? I don't know. Maybe women in office are not supposed to be effective in that dynamic that they're having about the way she was portrayed over time. So then the last one that I'm gonna read for y'all is another one that was written after she was out of office and kind of looking at what her career was like once she left the Secretary of Labor office. And this one was written in Nome, Alaska by the Nome Nugget, October 1945. So Miss Perkins embarks on her new career. Also, if Adelaide is a female name, another female reporter. Frances Perkins, at 63, is embarking on a new double-decker career as a writer and university lecturer. After 12 such stormy years as she weathered in the cabinet, most people would be glad to sit a while. But less than 3 months after she resigned as Secretary of Labor, Ms. Perkins sailed for Paris to represent Uncle Sam at the convening of the International Labor Organization, October 15th. At the same time, she began a weekly 500-word column to be distributed by the Institute for American Democracy. The Institute was founded 2 years ago for the purpose of furthering unity among the American people, irrespective of race, creed, or color. For the last 2 years, it has distributed to the religious, rural, and house organ press a weekly release dealing with subjects affecting American unity. Ms. Perkins' column, called Working It Out and Dealing with the Relation of Reconversion Problems to Unity, will be distributed in similar manner to the labor press free of charge. The Institute said, however, that Ms. Perkins would be paid for the column, though whether its representatives nor Ms. Perkins would say how much. Soon after her return to the United States, Ms. Perkins will begin a lecture series on labor relation problems at Radcliffe University. She said that she had also received invitations to lecture at other universities and probably would accept at least one. For the present, she will continue to make her home in Washington, where she lives with her husband, Paul C. Wilson, financial statistician. Ms. Perkins gives evidence of embarking on a new life in more ways than one. She has shed her famous three-cornered hat and donned a black beret. Her black frock, once as sober and severe as a judge's robe, is now trimmed with an open work-like collar backed with bright red. Her conversation, always swift as a river, is less measured now and liberally seasoned with smiles and jokes. And again, what does that say versus the one we just read?
That whole last paragraph, they'd never write that about a man.
No. And so again, this article brings up that question of how does her portrayal change over time now that she's no longer in office? You have that first one where she was too grim in office. And now you have this one where you're saying, well, she took off her hat, which that comes up in every article I've read about Frances Perkins. Is this hat and her black dresses. They concentrate quite a lot on her fashion choices. But she took off her hat. Yeah, her accessories, she took off her hat, she's wearing a French beret now, she's not as severe, she's having fun. It kind of reminded me of all the press that came out after former President Barack Obama left office. We were like, wow, he looks younger, he went on vacation, he must have aged, now he's reversing his age, now he's out of the office. But yeah, how does this change the way that she was shown in newspapers after she left office?
Well, one thing we were commenting on in the chat box was, I mean, again, yes, these are all by women writers, but were the women writers assigned her stories specifically because they were women and because the men in the office didn't want to write the stories on Frances Perkins? Or it just seemed like you're a woman, write about a woman. You know, I'm wondering if maybe that's the case.
That would be an interesting thing to learn. I'm not sure. I did find a couple of people who were male and wrote articles about her, but they were a lot shorter than the female ones I was able to find. So you're seeing the longer news articles.
Well, also, Kira brought up a good point that the time during which she was described as grim was the Great Depression. And now, I mean, we have already won World War II. So yeah, she's a little bit more laid back. I think that's the whole nation, not just this one woman.
That's a wonderful point. Well, yeah, again, quite an interesting one to share with your students to see how gender affected the way she was portrayed, how her status in office, when she was in, when she was out, how it affected the way she was portrayed. And then just some final discussion questions to round it all out. When you're done looking at the primary sources, you could ask them what were some overall descriptions of how Frances Perkins that was consistently showing up in the newspaper coverage of hers. So again, you're going to find that description of her tricorn hat and her black dresses quite a lot. Also about her being a little grim, a little not as open, not as inviting you into her private life as she probably should be. And then how did that perception of her and her effectiveness as a cabinet member change over time? I didn't include it in this PowerPoint, but it will be in the overall lesson plan. There was one that was like about 10 years after she had left office. She was still very active in labor discussions, but they had like a whole interview with her looking back on her career. And that one was the most positive one that I had read about her, where looking back, they're like, yeah, actually you did a lot. And how did you do that? And then they suddenly wanted to know all about her process and the things that she had done. And I hadn't found any interview like that for her while she was in office. So what does that retrospect in those 10 or 15 years later say about how she's portrayed now, and versus how she was portrayed in office? And the last one, which we've been talking about this entire time, was how did her gender affect the way she was portrayed in the paper, and how did it affect the way that people saw her in her role as a cabinet member? I think the newspapers here and the newspapers that will be in the larger lesson plan kind of all speak to these overarching questions of how we learn about Frances Perkins. So any final questions? Comments? You guys have been having funny comments. Okay, well, thank y'all. I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Graham so she guys can show you a couple more resources on how to teach Frances Perkins in your classes.
Thanks again, October. And again, you can download that PowerPoint for yourself, but it will be in more complete form in a formal lesson plan that we'll post to our website momentarily. So if you want to talk with October with any suggestions you have before that happens, then you can email me or Kira and we'll get those to her. All right, I am just going to go back. I have 2 more PowerPoint slides that I'm going to share. So I'm going to pick up where I left. Actually, no, I'm not going to pick up where I left. I'm going to pick up on the next slide. There we go. So again, you know, she had a long career after the New Deal. She had 20 years of her life after she left office. And so what did she do with it? So one thing that she did under President Harry Truman was she served on the U.S. Civil Service Commission. And so that was a very big job for her. She also lectured at various colleges. Of course, she was a guest speaker, like October mentioned, mostly associated with the New York State School of Industrial and Labor Relations, which is at Cornell. So she was at the Telluride House at Cornell there and very much attached with this and other institutions. And the headquarters of the Department of Labor building was named after her in 1980 during the Carter administration. This is not the building that she would have worked in. This was a building that was built in the 70s. But yeah, it's the one that's still in use today in Washington. And so this is the one that the bus driver, when driving by, made that awful joke about. But the image that you see is one panel of a whole series of panels called the History of Labor in America series that are murals, large-scale murals inside this building. And there are pictures of these panels available through the Carol Highsmith photograph collection on the Library of Congress. So this might be a really good teaching tool to show your students to kind of get them into whatever era that you're teaching. What does labor look like according to, an artist that came that came by years and years later. But I chose this panel because I liked the way that it represented a lot of movement and angles, and men, women, and children are all in there. And because this is the period during which Frances Perkins came of age. So if you click on it, you'll of course get to it at the Library of Congress, but also if you search the History of Labor in America series, or just Frances Perkins Building on the Library of Congress, you will get to all of the other ones as well. Okay, so I just have one slide of resources. So if you want to download that PowerPoint, then you can click on all of these. I am actually going to close the PowerPoint and show you the links from my computer because it's easier that way. Just real quickly here while we wrap up things. So I'm going to go to my web page, which is, okay. All right, here's me coming back into the Zoom meeting. Okay, yeah, there's the Google Drive. And then there's what I showed you already of the Office of the Secretary of Labor. So one of the first resources is this really great blog article from the Law Library, and it's called Promoting the General Welfare of Frances Perkins. And so I got a lot of information about her life from this article, which would be a really good kind of a good length to read in class, kind of contextual information, or to have as a homework assignment. It's just that long for maybe like high school students to read. So that's a good introduction to her life. I didn't finish it, but I was reading through this very, very long, it says a brief history, and I suppose it is compared to what it could be, of the U.S. Department of Labor, and that again is from the same website. They have a like a history section where there are a few links here, history of Labor Day, and past secretaries of labor, and all these other kinds of things that you can use. But there's also the Frances Perkins Center, and they have a whole website. They actually have her house as a National Registered Historic Landmark. And so they're dedicated to preserving that building as well as telling her story there. And they have on this website a lot of information about her. And if you go to Her Life, the Woman Behind the New Deal, this is a incredibly long and detailed biography, and also where I got a lot of information about her life. And this is her grandson next to her grave and the grave of her husband who predeceased her. Also, there's linked to this online exhibition at Columbia called Frances Perkins, the Woman Behind the New Deal. And it has all of these different chapters that just provides very quick contextual information about her. And then under each one, it has little subheadings where you can actually get primary sources from the Columbia University libraries. And so if you're looking for primary sources to use on her, this is another good place to find them under all of these different tabs. My internet's a little bit slow, so I'm going to move on. If you're teaching the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire lesson, there's a ton of materials available on that, of course, one of which I'm drawing attention to, is one created by one of our former graduate research assistants. That's available from our website. If you just go under lesson plans and you go under the post-civil reconstruction to the modern era, you'll find this one. And it's for high school, and it's really digging into you can see how many different primary sources there are, and digging into a lot of photographs.
Oh dear, I think we might have lost Stacy again. All right, let me.
Hello?
All right, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, and now my internet connection is unstable, so my computer tells me. So go. I'm sorry. She's eating sushi. So then I just linked to a web guide for New Deal programs. And then this is the author webcast, an author named Kirsten Downey, who wrote a whole book called The Woman Behind the New Deal. So if you're looking for a good book to read, you can check this out or just listen to her talk about it for an hour. And so those are all the links that are on the resources slide. And I will, do we have any finishing up now to do, Kira? I'm done.
Yeah, so just a couple things. Quick reminder, for those of you attending with us live, be sure that you have filled out that contact form that I dropped in the chat at the beginning. And when you fill that out, be sure that you add in your mailing address at the bottom of that form. Also, whether you are attending live today or if you're watching this recording later on, we do have a form for you to fill out in order to get your PD credit. Let me pull that up real quick and I can share the link for that. For those of you watching the recording, you can find it in the notes on YouTube for this session is where we will drop the link for that. Also, let's see. Need the link here for those of you who are with us live real quick, and I can drop that in. Like I said, for those of you watching the recording, check in the YouTube notes and we will put that there. And then just a couple of last minute things. Let's see here, let me share my screen real quick. We have a few other things that are happening coming up. Of course, Layla mentioned earlier the workshop that we are planning in Knoxville, March 31st. So again, if that's something that you're interested in, the focus of that one will be kind of back to basics strategies for using primary sources. So really getting into some analysis, ideas, ways to think about, bringing historical thinking, corroboration, all of those skills that are there in your social studies practices. We also, of course, will be at the Tennessee Council for Social Studies Conference. So if you are participating in that conference, be on the lookout for us. We have a session that will be presented during the virtual segment of the conference on February 22nd. And then we will be doing actually two sessions in person at the conference on Friday the 25th. So definitely be looking for that if you are there. In our Digging In series, we will be focusing on the New Deal. So if you didn't get enough New Deal stuff today and want more, we will be exploring some other ways of approaching teaching the New Deal on March the 10th. And then are also doing the National Council for History Education Conference in March as well. So if you happen to be participating in that, we will be there. Again, thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you are interested in summer PD, we will be starting to announce some of those events beginning next month in our newsletter. So definitely be on the lookout for that. We've got several exciting things in the pipeline for the summer and hope that you can join us for it. Again, thank you guys so much for your time, and we hope to see you at another webinar very soon.